I was asked to write it by someone at the Toronto Star, who wanted to explore different attitudes around the possibilities for and Chinese solidarity with particularly the black community, or maybe the indigenous population, or with other populations of color in Canada.
Oh, really? That
So
was he
yeah,
asked you to write
yeah,
about an
because
article. Okay.
because I've written about it before, just based on my reporting in the past couple of years. Like, I've gained somewhat of a reputation for covering these issues, so I was asked to write about it, but from a first person perspective this time. And so my goal was to point out that the prejudices, number one, to point out that the prejudices within our community are being organized. Before it was just in our living rooms, or in our, around the dinner table once in a while. But now we live in a very nativist, right wing, populist era. So, different politicians are aware that this kind of, playing to people's prejudices, or dog whistling to people's prejudices across communities, can actually lead to votes. It hasn't worked as well in Canada, but also we don't need we shouldn't need political bodies, or, you know, uh, advocates with certain progressive or conservative agendas in our communities or outside of our communities to come to us to try to get us to communicate with other peoples. That should be a common sense thing. We shouldn't need politicians, or, some advocate to be like, oh, you guys should organize around, working class issues or something like that, or like different anti-racism issues. Although that's perfectly valuable, I just feel like, in terms of common sense, there should be a more tolerant or outward-looking attitude among immigrants of all stripes, but particularly the community that I come out of.
Mhm.
The opinions the prejudices that we hold as a community was not always this politicized. It was more kind of like just stupid stuff, certain family members or certain friends would say because it made them feel better. You know, it made them feel good to say, I'm doing well as an immigrant, but look at these other groups, they're not doing so well. And, I worked really hard, in contrast to these other groups who can't get it together. But now that sentiment, in our time, in our era of kind of right wing, often nativist populism, that sentiment has been more politicized, and in a way, I think, by certain. I've never really seen. I mean, I've seen. I think we've all seen, one or two, you know, um, Conservative Party candidates try to do it. We've certainly seen, Maxime Bernier's party try to do it, like, across the board, to very limited effect. But there's definitely there's definitely also a small grassroots organizing faction within, at least within the Greater Toronto area, that is trying to do that. And these people are also trying to make an inroad into the broader Conservative Party, through, trying to be nominated and stuff. I've seen them mostly active on the municipal level, but particularly 2 years ago when we had our municipal elections in Toronto, but they had pretty much no success. And but at the same time, they're just louder than everybody else. I think it's pretty obvious that, you know the if you talk to people, if you talk to Chinese people or Chinese Canadians who have been involved in conservative, right-wing conservative politics in whatever capacity in the past, however many years, they will give you the line or they will try to make the case in various ways. They'll try to make the case that Chinese values, quote unquote, just as a whole, Chinese values.
What's the Chinese values you
Yeah,
think
good
they're
good
talking about?
question. Good question. Good, but they'll say Chinese values equal conservative values, and they'll say Chinese immigrants, like all immigrants, hardworking people, they care about the safety of their community. They don't want drugs, and they don't want crime in their community, which is dog whistling for marijuana legalization and irregular border crossers. Basically, 2 points where you can attack the Liberal Party on, which is what this whole thing is about. It ended up on Chinese social media, and I think a lot of the, if not a lot of the reaction, if not outright positive, there is a sentiment within Chinese attitudes, as far as I saw anyway, that was more that was supportive and at least recognize that there shouldn't be like this idea of like a chain of discrimination. Like Chinese people are discriminated by someone above, like a white man or whatever, that then they should project that onto someone below, whether they be Muslims or refugees or blacks or so on and so forth. So there is a kind of social self-awareness, at least I saw online. And the other part of the reaction on Twitter was very divided, and I was shocked. I don't know if I was shocked, but there was a lot of reaction tweets to the article that I think are probably not from real people. If you look at the handle, I'm pretty sure they were from some sort of bots or whatever.
Huh.
I don't want to speculate as to how much connection that has to do with elements within the Chinese government, but a huge amount of reaction were from profiles that didn't look real, that were probably fake. They had, like I said, handles with like 8 numbers on them. So I was a bit surprised by that, but also there were Chinese voices trying to engage me, saying you should keep this within the community. You should keep this within the family, so to speak, because right now black on Asian crime is really, really high. They would say stuff like that without providing any real evidence for it. And then they would say, once an article like yours gets out there, and this is from young, as far, if the profile is real, and I think this time it was a real one. This is from a young Chinese person living in the United States. Several young Chinese people living in North America actually told me this. If you write something like this and you put it out there, then that'll just increase the anger for among blacks, among non-Chinese people, to attack physically or otherwise attack the Chinese in Canada, in North America, because it would just fuel their argument that Chinese people are racist, and then increase their chances of attacking the physical safety of Chinese people, and that's why you should keep it within the family. So I think that was one of the like a major reactions, attitudes to what I had to write. And in terms of the generation gap that you talked about, I assume, just in general, that a lot of the younger people who I interact with from the Chinese Canadian community are more progressive or more aware of these issues. But number one, a lot of the older generation of just Chinese people who aren't kids anymore. They also have uh, everyday concerns that can be engaged by progressive politics in Canada. They don't necessarily fall into, like you were saying, your friend was saying, how they do come into contact, particularly in the working class, on the factory floor or wherever else, with all sorts of people. And it's much easier, I think, to see other people's humanity in that space. But they're not engaged by the left wing of the progressive wing of Canada, which is very white, which is very I think has its own insular, which is very, also not as rich or not as built up or not as structured as the some of the conservative organizers maybe. But this last election was the first one really where I saw younger Chinese Canadian candidates go into their own community to speak to Chinese Canadians in Markham and Scarborough and elsewhere about healthcare, about the minimum wage, about opportunities, and so on and so forth. How how their attitudes are galvanized politically. Like why are they like attracted to this nativist thing? I've I've talked the people I've talked to really see, the few of them who are involved in this like small subculture, political subculture of the immigrant far right or whatever you want to call it. They see it as like function,
Oh yeah,
like
function.
Chinese
Okay,
people,
Chinese
Chinese people
words.
finally getting a chance to be politically empowered,
Empower. Yeah.
which is like you would usually associate that with some kind of left-wing revolutionary rhetoric.
Yeah.
But in this case, we're seeing, a few of them at least, but still in an organized fashion, you know, do community rallies, like you were saying, or go to Ottawa to rally, or to align themselves with the far right, and they would say like this is, as our community is coming of age politically and coming into shape politically, we're finally able to speak up for ourselves instead of being victimized by others. And in this case, they're saying being victimized by the Liberal Party or being victimized by other people of color and
Yeah,
being
that's a
victimized by Muslim terrorists, victimized by black criminals and stuff like that, which is very different. I haven't really seen that before. Yeah. I think the burden falls a lot of it falls on younger Chinese Canadians, unfortunately, who are already dealing with not being able to find a job and that kind of thing. Many of them also have a tough time speaking to the older members of their families, including their parents, because they don't speak fluent Chinese anymore. That is a not very openly talked about issue within immigrant um, communities or families. So the burden is where does it start? I think it starts within people's families. I really do believe that's quite effective. But it's not effective if you can't communicate with your parents properly, and there's a big gap between because of that language barrier, there's a bigger and bigger gap in terms of how the two generations within the family see the world. And if you can't even have an everyday conversation properly with your parents, then certainly you won't be able to talk about these social issues in any depth with your parents in a way that actually convinces them. I think there's a flight from wanting to know that, and a flight from the Chinese language and Chinese heritage that makes it very difficult for a lot of Chinese youth to speak about these issues. But I'm speaking, in very generic terms because I also see the opposite. Um, Although in general, I think to answer your question, it starts with the different members of the family speaking to those closest to them, and then branching out into different Chinese community groups that are, the progressive ones do exist. There are a few of them who are active, particularly during COVID. And beyond that, it'll also take, like we were talking about, more meaningful engagement by, a more structured left in Canada to engage Chinese Canadian communities on issues of healthcare, on issues of the working issues, or issues of refugees, racial or social solidarity.